I live in New York City, and every morning I get up and I take the dog for a walk, and I always end up standing in the same spot, staring up at the same thing. Now, when you think about New York, most people think, oh, the Statue of Liberty, right? Times Square, maybe Central Park. But in my view, the great symbol of New York, the real symbol is this. It's the Chrysler Building, right? If you don't know what the Chrysler Building is, this is the most audacious, beautiful, impossible skyscraper ever built. For a time, it was the tallest building in the world, and it inspires me because I see it as a perfect example of what we can do if we just set aside all of our concerns and we dream big and we execute brilliantly. So the building always inspires me every morning when I stare up at it. Now, you probably have your own version of the Chrysler Building, right? Some great work of art, architecture, engineering, science, some product that changed the world, something that inspires you. But I can tell you one thing about it, whatever it is, it's just like the Chrysler Building in one way, which is they all come from the same source. They all come from the same place, a team. Teams are the fundamental building blocks of every great advancement in human civilization. Every great step forward is a monument to teamwork and a great collective effort. So teams are important. I think we can all agree that teams are important, but great teams, what about great teams? Great teams are everything. Now, a few years ago, a group of researchers, they did a study, and they asked workers across many different industries, thousands of them, to rate the team that they were currently on. And the highest rating that you could give your team was excellent. So I want to know how many of you would say that the team you are currently on is excellent. Let's see a show of hands. Okay. All right, I sense some peer pressure maybe going on here with that question. Anyway, I should say present company accepted, but okay. What was the result? Well, in the survey, that number came in at 15%. 15%, which suggests 85% of the teams out there are either mediocre or lousy. I was astonished by that number. I couldn't believe it. I mean, human beings have been on the planet for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, right? You know, the only reason any of us are sitting here today are teams and teamwork, right? Teams are essential. So over all that time, how have we not been able to figure out how to move that percentage up, how to fix the formula? It always confused me. I didn't understand that. So for many years, at the Wall Street Journal, I worked in sports, and I covered a lot of the big events in sports history, all the big ones of the year, and I spent a lot of time around great teams. And not great teams, but some of the greatest teams ever, the Bulls, the Patriots, the Yankees, Barcelona, teams that are really unforgettable. And I was always fascinated by them. You know, what is it that makes them so much better than every other team? So whenever I had a minute alone with any of these athletes or coaches, I would ask them that exact question, why? Why is this team so great? The only thing I ever learned from doing this was that most people on these teams hadn't really given that a lot of thought. You know, they kind of shrugged at the question. I mean, what I realized was that being on a great team, an elite team, one of the best teams ever, it didn't actually feel strange. It didn't feel like some alien abduction. It actually felt pretty normal, pretty natural. It just felt like everything was working the way that it should. It wasn't remarkable. So Tom Brady, I asked Tom Brady this question once, and he said there's no big secret to it. Do your job. Do your job. That's all it was in his mind. Now, as hard as it is to believe that, I started to think, you know, maybe they're right. Maybe it's not so complicated. Maybe the secret of great teamwork is something that's pretty obvious. Maybe the only reason we can't see it is that it's right at the end of our noses. What if we could figure out what it was? Wouldn't we be able to create more great teams to move that 15% up? So that's what started me on the course of my research. And this was in 2005. And I decided, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use sports as my laboratory. And I'm going to come up with a list of the 10 greatest teams in sports history. And then I'm going to study them and figure out what they had in common, right? And I will crack the case, right? I thought it would take 2 weeks. I said 2 weeks maybe, tops. So in the end, I did come up with that list. In fact, there weren't 10 teams, there were 17 teams on my list. But it didn't take 2 weeks or even 2 months or even 2 years. It took about 10 to put this list together. And the reason is that no one had ever done this before. No one had ever done an objective study of what the greatest dynasties in sports history are that was based on some really good criteria. So I had 8 tests that a team had to pass to make this list. Some of them were, they had to play at the highest level of competition in their sport in the world. They had to have played against the other great teams of the time. They had to have sustained their dominance, not for 1 year or 2, but for at least 4, and for many years more than that. They also had to do something unique, some streak of championships or consecutive win streak or something that no team had ever done. So all the teams on this list, look, we can debate this all day. There's some glaring omissions on this list, and I'll talk about one a little later. And there's some teams you've never heard of, because I had never heard of them. The Cuban women's volleyball team, the greatest Olympic team of all time. I didn't know anything. The Hungarian men's soccer in the 50s. I didn't know anything about these teams. Here's what I can tell you about them, though. They are freaks. Freaks. Outliers. They did things no team's ever done. They came out of nowhere, and they accomplished something that no team has ever done. So my theory was this. It doesn't matter. There are 100 more teams that were very close. On this list, though, I was convinced that if there is some DNA, some secret of great teams, it would have to be on that list. It had to be there. So that's where I started. Now, I took my teams and I said, okay, what is it? What's it going to be? And I looked at everything. I kicked the tires on every possible way. It wasn't talent. They didn't always have the best players. In fact, most of them didn't. It wasn't tactics or strategy. It wasn't money. It wasn't upper management. It wasn't even coaching. I was really surprised by that. Coaching wasn't the thing that made all these teams great. The one thing they had in common, and it was incredibly obvious, it was a pattern that just repeated itself over and over again. The one thing they had in common was that the beginning of their winning streak and the end corresponded very closely, if not precisely, to one thing. And it was the arrival of one player. And in every case, that player was the leader of the team or the captain. Now, this pattern was so clear that I didn't really believe it. I didn't understand how the leader, the player, the captain could be so influential inside a team. But there I was. Captains, right? Not where I thought I would end up. So I started looking at these people and studying them. I talked to all the ones that are still living and everyone who played with them, and I tried to figure out, who are these people? What's their secret? What makes them such great leaders? And what I realized right away was that they were nothing like the leaders that I would have imagined. Not at all. First of all, very few of them were stars. Most of them were role players, defenders, people who weren't the face of the team or the best player. They were not charismatic people either. They weren't celebrities. They weren't the face of the team. They weren't really comfortable in the spotlight. They were also really difficult to manage. They would push back against anything they thought was getting in the way of the team succeeding. And they would push the rules to the absolute breaking point. All of these things they did, in fact, many of the things they did I thought were things that would disqualify somebody from leadership. So this made no sense to me at all. I realized I had a lot to learn. So over many, many years of doing this study, I came up with all the things they had in common. There were 7 traits that these captains all had in common. And they all involved the way they led. And these were things they actually used to make their teams better in competition. And there were 7 of them, and here they are. These are the 7 traits of elite captains. Okay, I'm going to get back to this slide later. I wanted to go through a couple of them, if I can, that I think are really relevant in business. Now, the first one, carrying water. Okay, I mentioned that most of these captains were not stars, but sometimes to an incredible degree. And the first person I wanted to look at, I went straight to this person, Carla Overbeck. Now, if you don't know who Carla Overbeck is, that's okay, because you'd have to be a serious soccer geek to remember who she is. In 1999, the U.S. women's national team won the World Cup for the first time. It was this huge story. I mean, huge television ratings. You probably remember Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy and Brandi Chastain, and this was a big, big deal, right? Famous team. This team was great for longer than that, but the one person you don't know is who's the captain of that team. I don't think it would be a Ham, but no, it was Carla Overbeck. Now, there's a reason you don't know who she is, And the reason is pretty simple. She didn't care if you knew who she was. She had no interest in being the face of that team or the accolades or any public adulation. She was not someone who cared about the attention. I'll give you an example. So the team wins the World Cup. They fly to New York. They get the key to the city, ticker tape parade. They're on Letterman. The whole team is there except for one person. Carla Overbeck, all she wanted to do was win that trophy. She won the trophy. She didn't fly to New York with her teammates. She flew home. She was happy. She didn't need any of that. She was happy to have her teammates do it. I asked her what she did that day when her teammates were, riding in open cars down Broadway, and she said 3 loads of laundry. So there you go. She didn't care. The thing that confused me, which I really needed to know more, was, how do you lead that way? How's that leadership? How do you lead from the back like she did? She wasn't the star of the team or even close to his best player. She was someone who was a central defender who would never be in the highlights, never seemed to do anything dramatic or score, right? How do you lead that way? Well, I called one of her former coaches and I said, what was Carla's leadership style? And he said, I'll tell you a story. He said the team would go on these long road trips to Japan or Norway, and they'd be exhausted. The players would collapse in their beds, and within a minute or two, they'd get a knock on the door. And they open up the door, and here's Carla Overbeck, the captain of the team, and she's carrying their luggage, right, which she's brought from the bus to their rooms for them, right? And I said, well, that's a terrific story, but how is that leadership? And he said, listen, Carla Overbeck knew exactly what she was doing. She did hundreds of small acts of service for that team all the time. And by doing so, she made it very clear to her teammates that she did not care about herself. All she cared about was that team. She'd do anything for it. And what this did was it gave her this credibility. She was able to bank this credibility with her teammates, this currency. And she would spend that currency, but she didn't spend it, off the field. She spent it when it mattered, during competition. If you didn't have your head in the game, she was the first person over there to tell you to get it together. And if you did something great, she was the first person to congratulate you. She was incredibly communicative on the field with her teammates, even though she was quiet personally. And what this did is when she spoke to you, you knew where she was coming from. This wasn't about her ego. It was about the goals of the team. She had enormous credibility. And she was able to control this team emotionally that way. Now, she also controlled that team tactically. Because every time she got the ball, she would pass it immediately to a better athlete, to Mia Hamm, one of these great athletes. And over time, that created this dependency. Her teammates needed those passes from her. They wanted her approval. She was able to control the way the team played and also how it felt and how it reacted to adversity, everything. And she did it in the shadows. She never got any credit. No one even knew who she was. And she was fine with that. Now, the lesson for all of us is you got to be a little bit like Carla Overbeck. It's the hardest thing to do. It has to be enough that your team wins. And frankly, if you're the one getting the attention and the promotion and all the adulation, you're probably not doing it right. You have to do the thankless work in the shadows that your team needs done. That's what leadership really is all about. And if you do that, you're going to have to let other people shine. And you have to be okay with it. But that's the way to be a great leader. It takes an incredible amount of selflessness, and you have to be able to work in the shadows and be okay. All of these captains had that trait. All right, the next one that I think is relevant to you is practical communication. Now, if you think about what athletes do or anyone does when they want to motivate a team before a big event, what do? The speech, right? Do what I'm doing now. They give a big speech. It's like you got to say the right words at the right moment, like with just the right amount of passion to fire everyone up. That's what I thought too. That's the Hollywood version, right? But I looked at these captains, I was astonished. One of the most astonishing things. Not a single one of them liked giving speeches. In fact, some of them never did. Carlos Puyol, the captain of Barcelona, told me that in his entire career, he never talked to the team as a group. Never, not once. They didn't like doing this. They didn't think they were good at it sometimes, but they just didn't think it was effective. This blew me away. So I said, all right, if they're not giving speeches, how do they communicate? How do they communicate with their teammates? Well, I went straight, again, right to the example that confused me the most, which is Tim Duncan. Now, if you don't know who Tim Duncan is, he was the captain of the San Antonio Spurs, one of the great dynasties in NBA history, 5 NBA titles, highest long-term winning percentage, 18 straight playoff appearances, all under his watch. A team that does not get enough credit for how brilliant it was. he was a brilliant basketball player and a great leader, but if you know anything about Tim Duncan, he has the personality of a vacuum cleaner. Right? I mean, have you ever seen an interview with him? I mean, he's the least charismatic person you've ever met. He's just a blank slate. People have called him the most boring superstar in sports. So I want to know, how does Tim Duncan motivate people, right? So I spent a lot of time with his team, watching them play and practice and watching them interact with each other. And what I realized was that Tim Duncan actually talks a lot in that team context. But his communication is not the kind that you would think. It's not what you would think a leader does. His method is he will pull individual players aside, and he will pull them aside, and he will have a conversation. He's constantly looking for who needs his attention. And as soon as he sees someone who needs something, he takes them aside, and he has a very engaged, intense conversation with them where he listens as much as he talks with great engagement. He uses his eye contact and his gestures and his facial expressions to emphasize his point. And it's an incredibly effective way to communicate. It's not speeches, it's just hard work, one-on-one communicating with people. Now, all these studies have shown that the same thing is true in business. Great business teams have someone like that who circulates widely, approaches everyone, and has intense conversations that are two-sided. What this does is it creates a culture where no problems fester. Tim Duncan addressed every issue in the moment as it happened. Nothing ever festered. The team never developed any resentments that tore it apart. Everyone knew they were going to be able to have their say, but that they were also going to be held accountable, right? So they were very talkative, and that's the secret to longevity. That's the secret to sustaining success, is having that open communication. So for all of you in your teams, look, this can be kind of liberating. You don't have to have a silver tongue to be a great leader. You don't. You just have to put the work in. Different kind of communication. All right, I want to talk about some takeaways from my research. And the first question I always get is, are great leaders made or born? Now, you may not have the characteristics of these elite captains, but here's the thing. Take another look at that list of the 7 traits, right? And I want you to think about what's not on that list. What's not on that list? God-given talent, charisma, natural ability. You know, it's great to have, don't get me wrong, but you don't have to have it. It's not a requirement to be a great leader. All of these things are about one thing, and that is behavior. It's just leadership is just a form of behavior. It's something that can be modeled, right? Anyone can get better at it. You can make better choices and become a better leader. So remember that. I mean, it's really about thinking about what you do in every situation. Every leadership situation is a right way to respond and a wrong way. And you can figure out how to make better decisions and make your team better. All right, I lied a little bit when I said that's the first question I always get. So, especially in this town, okay, I'm not going to spoil the book. I wrote a whole chapter about this because it was fascinating. The Bulls didn't quite make my top list because they didn't win enough titles, as many titles as the Celtics or as long as the Spurs. They didn't do anything unique. But it's a technicality because they totally fit in this model. And they had one of the great leaders that I've seen in sports in the U.S. Here's the thing. It's not this guy. Everyone thinks Michael Jordan was the leader of that team. Michael Jordan is a phenomenal basketball player. He was not a great leader. And if you look at that list of traits, you'll see why. There are a lot of things he just did not do. They didn't become good 6 years before he won a championship. They did not become good until Phil Jackson decided in 1990, at the beginning of the season, to make another player the co-captain of the Chicago Bulls. That is the exact precise moment they became a championship team and started winning titles. I'm not going to say any more than that. You'll have to check it out. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit. I think I'm short on time. I wanted to. This is not advanced. Oh, there we go. This is a book. I wanted to talk a little bit about corporate environment, and I've always been saying that managers are incredibly important, and not just the CEOs at the top, but the people who are in the front lines managing people. Those are the teams that really make or break you. And that's where these leadership traits are important. And Gallup just came out with this book in which they did a 10-year study, and they found that basically 70% of the battle in terms of having productive, happy, engaged teams is the quality of the manager. So I was very happy to see that. I like putting it up here because it kind of validates my research, and I think it's something you should all think about. Those managers are incredibly important and how they lead. Okay, before I go, so what I've been doing since the book came out, is I'm working with a lot of teams, and I'm consulting with them, trying to help them get better. And I've worked with NFL teams and baseball teams, college teams. I work with the Marine Corps. I work with some businesses as well to help them build a better leadership culture. Now, I've spent a lot of time working with the Chicago Bears up the road. And I've been working with them for a couple years, and I spent most of my time with Mitchell Trubisky, who's the quarterback. Obviously, you know that. And he is the rare athlete who really cares about leadership and is studying it as a student would and trying to be as good as he can. We spend a lot of time working on everything from his body language and communication to how he interacts with his teammates. And I have seen it just last season, from the first few games into the next, I saw him develop his leadership skills to a point where he was doing things at just next level. You know, he really became the leader of that team and was actually elected the captain before the playoffs. He's got, whatever it is, he's got it. He's got that intangible leadership quality and that ability to relate to other people and the right mindset. Here's what I want to end with, and I want you to all think about. Mitchell Trubisky very clearly, almost very nearly did not make it. He almost didn't make it. You know why he didn't make it? Because in college he didn't play a lot. The reason he didn't play a lot, you know what one of the reasons was? Because he had coaches who didn't think he was leadership material. He had coaches who thought he wasn't mean enough, orderly enough, fiery enough. He was too nice. He was too, friendly. He was quiet. He was too grateful. It was just the qualities they didn't really think of as leadership qualities, right? So he lost playing time for that. Mitchell read my book, and it's like a light went on in his head. He said this. I had somebody saying it. He said, wait a minute. There's another way to do this. That's me. That's who I am. That's how I want to lead. That's how I want to do it. And that's the reason we started working together. But I want you to remember one thing. If you want to try to build this culture inside your own company, or you want to be better yourself as a leader, the important thing to do is to remember that these qualities are not obvious. These great leaders are not the first people you notice. Sometimes they're the last person you would ever expect would be the leader of your team. It's not about what people say, what they look like, the vibe. It's about what they do. It's about their behavior. It's about the choices that you make. You know what? It actually is pretty simple in the end. It's very simple. Leadership is the key to great teams. And it's a simple process. The problem is it's not easy. Usually the decision that you have to make, the right decision, is the hard one. It requires an incredible amount of work and sacrifice on your part. Bill Russell, the great captain of the Boston Celtics, I want to close with a quote from him, which has always stuck with me and is a great way, I think, to think about teams and to think about leaders in a different way. He was asked about his mindset as a leader, and he said this. He said, "My ego demands for myself the success of my team." Let me repeat that. My ego demands for myself the success of my team. Thanks a lot.